The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the crunch of boots on dry leaves. A group of cops dragged their prisoner through the dark woods, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. But this was no ordinary prisoner. Her hands were tied, her uniform torn, yet her eyes burned with defiance. She was a general, a leader who had earned the loyalty of thousands, a woman whose name carried weight on every battlefield. The officers thought they had done the impossible, catching her off guard. With a rope pulled tight, they bound her to a tree, convinced the hunt was finally over. One of the cops smirked, whispering that without her command, her army would scatter like frightened birds. But the general didn't beg. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she lifted her head high, her voice calm as she said, "You don't know what's coming." The men laughed, mistaking her words for empty pride. They didn't realize she wasn't warning them. She was telling them the truth. The woods around them grew eerily still. A faint rustle echoed through the darkness, too steady to be the wind. The cops exchanged uneasy glances, gripping their weapons tighter. The beam of one flashlight caught the glint of metal in the distance, then another and another. It wasn't random, it was organized. It was the unmistakable formation of soldiers closing in. The general's lips curved into the faintest smile. For the first time, fear flickered in the officers' eyes. What they thought was a victory was about to turn into a trap of their own making. Every second stretched longer, the silence broken by the slow, deliberate steps of hundreds surrounding them in the trees. Before the cops could decide whether to run or fight, the forest came alive with shadows. The general's army had arrived, and their commander, though bound, was far from powerless. What happened in that moment would decide everything. Do you want me to also write the continuation for the main story narration after this intro, or just keep this cliffhanger as the opening? The soldiers moved like shadows, their footsteps blending with the forest floor. The cops, who only moments ago were boasting about their capture, now stood frozen, caught between disbelief and rising fear. Their radios crackled with static, useless in the thick woods. They had underestimated her, thinking she was just another fugitive in uniform. What they didn't know was that this general wasn't only respected, she was loved. Every soldier under her command had sworn loyalty not out of fear, but because she had once stood beside them in battles where survival seemed impossible. The general stayed silent, her eyes locked on the officers who had tied her to the tree. She didn't need to speak, her presence alone was enough to ignite her army's resolve. Somewhere in the distance, a signal rang out, a sharp sound that echoed through the forest. It wasn't loud, but it carried meaning only her soldiers understood. The formation tightened, closing in like a noose. The cops shifted nervously, trying to convince themselves they still had the upper hand. One of them barked orders, raising his weapon, though his hands shook. But deep down, he knew the truth. They weren't the hunters anymore. They were the prey. Every tree, every shadow seemed alive with soldiers ready to strike. The story of how they caught the general was already strange. Rumors said she had allowed herself to be taken, stepping into the trap as though she had planned it. Was she testing her army's loyalty? Was this a strategy none of them could see yet? The uncertainty gnawed at the cops, making their fear heavier with every second. The tension grew unbearable. The army was close enough now that their silhouettes circled the clearing, weapons raised, eyes fixed. The air felt charged, like a storm about to break. And still, the general did not move, she only waited. The clearing seemed smaller with every breath the cops took. Their flashlights trembled in their hands, beams bouncing off helmets and weapons glinting in the darkness. The general remained tied, her posture calm, almost regal, as if the ropes binding her were nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. Her silence spoke louder than any command, and that unnerved the officers more than the army that now surrounded them. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Each one had been with her through battles that had tested loyalty and courage beyond measure. She had once led them through mountain storms with no supplies, sharing her own rations to keep her people alive. She had carried the wounded on her back, refusing to leave anyone behind. That was why they were here now, stepping out of the shadows. For her, their loyalty forged in fire and sacrifice. The cops whispered among themselves, trying to piece together how things had spiraled so quickly. They had believed the mission was simple: capture the general, deliver her, and collect their praise. But the deeper truth was becoming clearer. She wasn't just a leader. She was the heart of an entire force, and without her, they would never. Yield the forest felt alive with anticipation. Every branch creaked. Every step of the soldiers was deliberate, closing in like a tightening circle. The cops knew calling for backup would be pointless. By the time help came, it would already be too late. Still, one of them tried to mask his fear with bravado, shouting that they would fire if anyone moved closer. But the words fell flat, echoing weakly against the steady rhythm of boots on the ground. And then came the moment that made their blood run cold. The army stopped moving, all at once, as if waiting for a single command. Yet the command never came from the general's lips. She only lifted her head and stared into the eyes of the men who thought they had one. The night air grew heavier, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. The circle of soldiers stood frozen, their weapons steady, eyes locked on the group of officers. The cops could feel it. The balance of power had shifted completely. The ropes around the general suddenly looked less like restraints and more like a test. Was this entire scene part of her plan all along? The thought gnawed at them, sending a ripple of panic through their ranks. One officer tried to keep control, his voice cracking as he barked for the soldiers to stay back. But his words had no weight. Even he could hear the fear lacing every syllable. The army didn't flinch. They were waiting, perfectly still, like predators poised before the final strike. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the sound of the wind brushing through the leaves and the uneven breaths of the trapped officers. The general lifted her chin, her gaze sharp, unyielding. She hadn't spoken since her warning, yet her presence seemed to command the entire clearing. The officers realized something terrifying: she didn't need to give an order. Her army already knew what to do. Their discipline, their unity, their loyalty were stronger than any chain, stronger than any rope tied around their leader's hands. One of the cops gripped his weapon tighter, finger hovering nervously near the trigger. Another muttered that they should retreat before it was too late, but the circle had already closed too tightly. There was no way out. Every direction they turned, they met the cold stare of soldiers who would give their lives for the woman bound to the tree. The tension climbed higher, each second stretching unbearably long. The officers were trapped in a moment that could explode at any instant. And as the silence deepened, the general finally drew in a slow breath, her eyes locking with the man who had tied the knot around her wrists. The general's steady gaze held the officer frozen in place. But before anyone could move, a sound split through the night. It wasn't the signal of her army, it was something else. A low mechanical hum began to echo across the forest, growing louder with every passing second. The soldiers shifted uneasily, their formation holding strong. But their eyes flicked upward toward the dark sky. The cops looked just as startled, confusion breaking through their fear. For a moment, everyone's attention turned from the clearing to the treetops. The hum transformed into a roar, and faint beams of light swept through the branches. It wasn't reinforcements for the general, and it wasn't more officers either. Something unexpected was arriving, and no one seemed prepared for it. The general's expression didn't change, but a flicker of recognition crossed her eyes. She knew this sound. She knew who was coming. Her army stayed rooted, waiting for her unspoken lead, but even they looked unsettled by the intrusion. The cops, sensing a shift they couldn't control, felt a new wave of dread wash over them. They had believed they were surrounded by just one enemy, but now it seemed another force had entered the game. The forest grew brighter as shadows of unfamiliar figures stretched across the ground. Heavy footsteps joined the mechanical hum, and soon the tree line glowed with strange, cold light. The officers exchanged frantic glances, whispering that maybe backup had finally arrived, but the looks on the soldiers' faces told a different story. This wasn't help. This was a complication no one had counted on. Bound to the tree, the general finally allowed a small, sharp smile to appear. Her voice, calm but edged with meaning, broke the tense silence. It seems the night has more players than you expected. The circle of soldiers tightened. The cops raised their weapons, and the unseen newcomers moved closer. The stakes had just doubled, and now the forest itself felt like the center of a storm. No one could escape. The forest exploded with light as the newcomers stepped into view. They weren't police reinforcements, and they weren't allies of the general either. They were mercenaries, hired hands, armed with advanced gear, moving with the confidence of men paid to finish what others could not. The cops are